forget about the title for the moment. I don't like going personal, especially in the lecture, since especially my positionality as a scholar based in the global north has taught me how much that positionality is very much essentialized in different ways. But I thought since I'm here in different capacities, I need to reintroduce myself and connect that to why actually I'm going to talk about some of the issues I want to talk about. Now, after spending some few formative years in the troubled Zaire at the time, I came here and studied law in Butare at the time, Uye Primary 8, something that Ties maybe doesn't like anymore because that's where he got his burger. I ate a few times in that hotel. And we had already some reflections about the type of law we were studying at the time. Law inherited from Belgium. The books were still actually from the former government. Not many were yet reformed. We were taught by quite a majority of non-even Rwandan scholars because most of the Rwandan scholars had been killed. So I got taught, for those who are international law, my general course on general international law introduction was taught by William Shabas, for example, who came out of that international sense of guilt vis-a-vis Rwanda, came to give something to the Rwandan community, including lecturing, for which I, as a scholar, was and still am grateful, of course. But the first point I made already was I studied quite very few things, very limited anything about ICTR. But despite that, I had a personal interest in knowing what the ICTR was. So in 2002, I applied to go for what had just started an exchange between the Faculty of Law and the tribunal to familiarize Rwandans with the work of the tribunal. I went for 2 months with a group of others. We were 6. My interest grew there to learn more because 2 months was not enough. And I went back after graduation for an independent 6 months. I left the tribunal, worked a little bit here, and then went for a master's in Sweden. My first introduction to the global north, Sweden. And in the process, of course, I became God. But that's another story. Now, when I was finishing there, human rights and all of that, I got a PhD position, and a long process of framing the topic, it ended up being something around indigenousness in Africa. I published a book with Springer Asset on that. And that was really around the problematic nature of identification of certain given groups as indigenous on the African continent in different ways than what was the frame at the time of the colonial encounter until the independences. So collective identities, in fact, was my first kind of line of entry to the kind of topics we are discussing today. So since I had a training in human rights, I ended up, of course, doing some few things around human rights, and most interestingly, coming from here, that's only the time after that I started doing things around transitional justice. So it's not therefore surprising that when we are discussing things around transitional justice, I can't help but keep the collective element into the frame of discussing the processes that deal with international crimes. Hence my title, Sarah. But why am I doing this? The orientation of my talk will be around more or less what you can read there. The focus will be around what I call the marginality of the collective in international justice mechanisms. What I will, in certain given sense, I could have even put in the title, what I'd like to term as the collective blind spot in international law or international criminal law. And in doing that, and of course many scholars talk about impact, but I know how difficult also it is to measure impact or to assess impact or to talk impact. But still I will explore and discuss and put on the table, at least for the debate, what that impact of marginality of the collective in international law, how that also, especially when it comes to repair, does affect or potentially affect peace, stability processes in the context that we are studying or we are examining or that we are adjudicating, if you will. And I will start, many started at the theoretical level in the lectures that we have at the beginning, but I will start at the micro level. So, and I will bore you with something that you have heard ad nauseam maybe, with the Lubanga case. It's probably the most known, quoted, and written about case in international criminal legal scholarship and related literature. But I thought that with all the caveats needed in the pretension of bringing something new, I thought that I may present a different way of reading the Lubanga case or debating the Lubanga case by situating Lubanga in context and exactly at looking at both the individual and the collective. So hence I will ask, and we will ask the question, who was Lubanga? And the was here is within the context of the proceedings before International Criminal Court and the narration or narrative that is generated there. But also then, who is Lubanga today, now that he has been especially released? Oh, I was about to, so my introduction said that probably the Lubanga is the most known case, and I will bore you with some things around Lubanga. So let me not bore you about some things around Lubanga. Who can bore me about some things about Lubanga? Who is Lubanga? I will skip you in the sense of fairness. I know Thais has been following religiously proceedings before the International Criminal Court. I will give you the floor in the second tier. If I get another volunteer, of course, I will not refuse to you. Who can tell me anything about Lubanga? Yes, please. I'm coming back to you.
It's been a while since I looked at his case, but the first defendant before the International Criminal Court? Oh, a little bit more. No, I don't think I have anything else.
Yeah, fair enough.
From the Democratic Republic of the Congo.
From the Democratic Republic of the Congo. Thank you. Sorry?
Well, if I also recollect, accused of rape, but I'm not sure that was successfully. Child soldiers. Yeah. So yeah. Okay. So you see, you should go to Thais.
I was about to say I'm happy to see that faculty can also cheat. Alfonso was already giving him her answers, so I'm glad we don't have youngsters studying here. Yeah. Who would you present Lubanga?
So Thomas Lubanga is from the Democratic Republic of the Congo. His full name is Thomas Lubanga Diilo. He actually was a psychology graduate from the University of Kisangani. He's actually quite a well-educated man, who in his younger years actually became a politician in Ituri, and particularly in Bunia and the region around it. Was involved in an uprising against the government of Congo. Was also involved in quite some violence, as reported by human rights organizations and journalists. Most notably, the massacre of UN peacekeepers and some genocidal acts, for which he was also arrested in Congo and spent a year in prison on an indictment by the Congolese, up till Luis Moreno Ocampo begged for him to come to the ICC, where he tried him only for 3 war crimes of enlisting, conscripting, and using child soldiers under the age of 15, for which he was convicted. Although the fact was never proved, but we can talk about it later.
Fantastic. He did already much of the job for me. Yeah, Lubanga is that person. But as far as my talk is concerned, you will see that what I want to insist on also is missing a little bit in that, basically, that's a biography you will easily find at the International Criminal Court. But of course, what I will also be presenting is there, but the lack of insistence on that, I will claim, is part of some of the problems that we encounter in dealing with some of the situation. So Thais said many of these. So this is the kind of simple chronology, factual kind of presentation. Leader of that party, active in the 2000s, arrested in Kinshasa, spent nearly a year in the jail in Kinshasa under Congolese prosecution, something which was part of Phil Clark's talk. But he was only indicted a year later by the International Criminal Court in what many present as a very kind of opportunistic case for the court, taken to The Hague, of course, with all of the muscle of the International Criminal Court at that date, convicted in 2012, sentenced for 14 years of imprisonment for enlisting and conscripting children under 15 years and using them in hostility. Here I'm using the ICC lingo. And he was imprisoned in The Hague initially, but then transferred to serve a remainder of his sentence in Kinshasa in the notorious Makala prison. So the first image represents the Lubanga image of warlord, if you will. The second presents him before the ICC, that court process. And the third represents what many presented as the significance of the Lubanga case within the international criminal justice narrative. Because many international proponents of international criminal justice presented the Lubanga verdict, the very first at the International Criminal Court, as a milestone, a vindication of victims' rights. And I'm just naming some of the organizations that were making that or close enough to similar statement, including this caption of one of the statements. This was by Human Rights Watch. But Lubanga was, as I said, condemned, sentenced to 14 years. He had served already a number of years pre-trial. So in 2000, he was released. This is Lubanga the day of his release in a very big church in Kinshasa, celebrating Mass, a Catholic Mass with his community, thanking God for his release, being celebrated, if you will, by members of his community. Why was he celebrated? Why were there fans of Lubanga, a suspect who was found guilty and imprisoned? Who can guess? Or who knows the answer to that? Which is another question to who is Lubanga? So he's from Ituri, from which community? The Hema. And the Hema, the conflict, the articulation of conflict, keeping in mind all of the complexities, was between the Hema and the Lendu. Lubanga is a Hema. He was found guilty for enlisting children, mostly from which communities would you guess? The Hema community, his community. In fact, I had even 1 week ago a long discussion with a very prominent member of the Hema community, and that would be central to my talk today. Lubanga, for probably the majority, subject to more investigation, probably for the majority of members of the Hema community, Lubanga was and is and remains a hero who had been fighting for his community. So the international criminal narrative presenting him as this notorious warlord / criminal, the image of the bad guy in an international criminal narrative, serves certain given purposes, except Lubanga, the criminal, his community, the Hema necessarily, which found itself divided when it comes to the framing of both the victim and the perpetrator. Because the victims in the Lubanga case were Hema, and the perpetrator, of course, found guilty was Hema. And very importantly, and talking to this person, who is an enlightened person, all those witnesses, child soldiers and so on, are presented in some Hema narrative as manipulated / traitor individuals to their communities, because Lubanga had been fighting for the survival of his community. And I'm quoting him. Now, and that explains the reason why, even today, after getting out of jail, his party, UPC, is still a registered party. He is the head of that party. He has a provincial deputy in Ituri. And very importantly, the impact not beyond Ituri is the fact that that particular party and I will spare you details about the Congolese politics. I can spend 2 hours here. Recently, Tshisekedi went to power with some kind of arrangement with Kabila, the predecessor. But then after the power, he found all ways to break that kind of agreement with Kabila. And part of that was poaching kind of followers from different parties. One of those parties is Lubanga's party. And they formed what is known as Union Sacrée platform. Lubanga is one of those, which explains the next as a peacemaker. Now, some proponents of international justice will say, look at the picture now of reform. Lubanga goes to prison, comes back, he's a convert now, he preaches peace. He doesn't. There are still conflicts between the communities. He was appointed the coordinator of the task force by the president, and looking at peace and reconciliation issues with the needed ethnic balancing, of course, that was performed there. But a few weeks into his mission, he was taken hostage by the new rebels now active, the Codeco that I had on the previous slide. It was at the beginning of this year. He spent quite several weeks in captivity. And through some trick which I will not go into with many details, and then I would lose my time, he managed to get freed or free himself with some tricky stuff in April just this year. But then what I really want to come up by telling this story is the positionality and the situation of Lubanga yesterday and today when it comes to defining his personality as a member of the Hema community, an active member of the Ituri/DRC identity politics. Where does he fit in all of that, yesterday as today? And what does that mean for the verdict that we got in the Lubanga case, or even the act of serving sentence? But also then, where does he fit, or his story does fit, in the type of justice mechanism many of the speakers before me have been talking about? In bringing Lubanga, I wanted to bounce back on some of the issues that have been highlighted by many speakers before me, both Kamari, Phil, of course, who have been working also around the area, but also the many speakers before me, including most eminently Chris and Jill, of course. Things around both the framings we make around perpetrators, but also the framings of victimhood. And we are all familiar with how these generally dominantly are framed. Now, when I'm talking about these issues, I keep always the insistence on the fact that, yes, we are in a space here where we are discussing broad theorizations in terms of, and broad theorization, of course, have a tendency to, in a certain given way, whether intended or not, to homogenize certain given complex realities. But I keep in sight in discussing many things I'm discussing now that we have different contexts, different types of conflicts in which there are differentiated issues, but also different interests and different actors. Yes, we may have similarities in certain given perspectives, but also we need to keep in sight certain given differences that are very much contextual in discussing things around both perpetration and victimhood, both in terms of individuation of that responsibility, but also in looking at it in the collective dimension. But most importantly, what puzzled me in much of my work, as informed by the introduction that I gave, is the fact that the many crimes that today are categorized as so-called international crimes, genocide, crimes against humanity. Let me stop there. War crime, most of the time in legalistic sense, is a crime committed by combatant against a civilian. It can be one. The idea of pattern doesn't necessarily have to result therefrom. But if you look at the very definition of genocide, what is a genocide? It's the intention to destroy, at least the legal definition, there may be others, but in the legal definition, in the Genocide Convention, it's the intention to destroy in whole or in part a certain given defined group, and the name of the groups are listed. So the group features prominently in the very definition of genocide. Therefore, the crime may be committed against specified individuals, but you can't ignore the group whenever you are talking about genocide without doing injustice to the very idea of the definition itself. The same applies to a certain extent to the crime against humanity category, because they require a certain given pattern or systematic nature, which may be, of course, be against a wide population without necessarily that population constituting a group. But in the practice of many different conflicts that we have known today, most of that pattern basically it signifies that a given collective has been targeted, and maybe the threshold may not reach the genocide in nature, but a given collective has been targeted. So if you look at the very definition of some of the prominent international crime categories, you have the group featuring very much prominently. And that plays at a different level, both at the level of perpetration, when individuals are perpetrating international crimes, think Lubanga, think many others, either they do it as individuals, and they may be held accountable as individuals, or they are part of dynamics of group kind of, let's say, they are part of group dynamics, meaning that they were participating in certain given actions defined as legitimate by that particular group. In that sense, then, it's then easy very much to shift on, okay, it's a collective responsibility. It may, then I would follow that thread. But then when we talk about collective, you need to be very careful in the way you define the collective. Crimes may be committed, and here is the nuance that I like to follow in many kind of narratives we have had today, in these last days. Crimes may be committed in the name of the collective. But an important nuance then is that in many ways, there are many issues in then calling those crimes as crimes of a collective. Because I haven't found any single collective that has all been involved equally in perpetration of any given crime. So in that sense, the actors may act in the name of collective, or may even draw certain given level of legitimacy from a group, and may even have ways of proving that level of legitimacy. But still, there has been that tension between both attributing responsibility to the individual and attributing it to a given collective, and establishing a boundary between the individual and the collective. But most importantly, I guess my point in drawing the attention to this, much of the predominance of the individuation of responsibility within these dynamics where the collective plays a very prominent role does do quite a lot of disservice to future dynamics of what I said later in terms of thinking peace, stability, and long-term, let's say, journey outside the conflict. So if you look at the way the Lubanga case was framed, including the communiques about vindication of victims' rights, I remember some of the communiques were really talking about victims in the DRC situation. And I remember thinking from the time already how wrong that was. Because the day Lubanga was condemned, it's a fact that there were many Hemas who were mourning that condemnation. And many Hema victims who are mourning that condemnation. Hema victims, without talking about the Lendo victims. Now, keep in mind now that I'm talking about only Lubanga and crimes committed within dynamics that only regard the Hema situation. And many international lawyers have explored already how that condemnation, probably critical analysis scholarship has explored how that condemnation was in itself problematic for focusing on this intra-Hema kind of dimension without looking at the most serious crimes of the armed groups claiming to represent the Hema vis-a-vis armed groups claiming to represent the Lendu. By the way, that's the kind of language I like to use, armed groups claiming to represent this, rather than the groups of this or the groups of that. Because, as I was just saying, the realities are a little bit more complex, and they are part of complex dynamics. So then, that begs the question of who is held responsible for what exactly, and for who is the benefit in terms of defining victimhood, which will be my next slide. So there is really this raises quite a very important question about what the individuation of criminal responsibility, which is dominant in our many legal mechanisms, both at the ICC, but also by very many mechanisms at the domestic level, inherited most of the time from the colonial structures that define statehood today in many, including conflict situations. That individuation of criminal responsibility does have, first of all, an impact on collective dynamics, but also does probably impact quite peace processes if you are to, let's say, bring more strong dialogue between both international criminal justice or international literature and peace-building literature, if you will. Now, that brings me to my third element where I talk about repair in terms of victimhood. Again, I'm at this point of individuation of and collect the individual and the collective where they fit in the whole frame. When now we talk about victims of conflict, I guess it's a familiar debate about where this comes from, and that was my previous point about this idea of the liberal individualism. The individual is always this person who is trying his best to liberate himself or herself from many collective chains in the name of liberty and the pursuit of happiness. That's the typical liberal mantra, at least, that we have been served. The reality is, though, at least those who are more in the political science kind of domain are more familiar with the literature than I am. Of course, if you look at the likes of Michael Sandel, when they talk about, they promote their idea of communitarianism, but also you look at a lot of other literature which a little bit nuanced, also the romanticization of collectivism. You look at many features of many, especially rural African societies, many traditional African societies, at least my understanding, and I stand here to be indicted by our elders like Siba here, at least the many African societies that I know did hold, and many still hold, quite very strong collective identitarian kind of notions, but also systems that are part of a daily life. And many individuals can hardly imagine themselves from communities. I was still raised to present myself as, and here I go, Ndahinda, Wamukwiza, Wankoko, Warurakaza, Rwamutuganyi, Wamududa, Wabjabagabo, Jasekabumba, Karugorora, and I can go on. I just counted 10 of my ancestors. And I was raised to learn that I'm part of that. And many Africans are taught to internalize these. How they negotiate that themselves is a different idea. And it depends also on positionality, space, time, and so on. That being said, there are many civil societies which very much hold strong ideas about themselves, and then how those kind of notions play out in terms of any forms of individuation, whether it's in terms of victimhood or perpetration, does kind of affect whatever you do. In that sense, and that may or may not impact the criminal justice processes that are most of the time individuated. In that sense, then balancing the individual, as I had said previously already, in framing victimhood also is problematic. And it's problematic even because many of the notions of victimhood that we have come to internalize are very much informed by this notion of individuation. A prominent scholar in the field of victimology, former colleague of mine, Jan van Dijk, who is a criminologist, in 2009 published an article entitled "Free the Victim." And part of the article really is that he dived into the semantics of the origin of the word victim from most Western languages. And his finding was that he used Dutch, even Icelandic, German, French, English, and so on. His finding was that victim derives from many origins, but it has this idea of sacrificial lamb. So the victim is this passive unit who deserves our commiseration, our sympathy, and so on. But of course, then, from the very definition, and it is this individual, of course, but from that very definition, then, our responses to how we frame victims are shaped by that idea of victim as this passive individual. And most of the time, when victims do not conform to those kind of ready-made ideas about victimhood, of course, they no longer deserve words, they no longer deserve our sympathies. It can be easily, as he said, societal responses to crime victims tend to turn from sympathy to antipathy when victims defy expected victims' roles. So, in essence, our many notions of individuated victimhood tend to shift depending on how victims behave or face. And here we are talking about victims indeed still as individuals. How you frame collective victimhood then, it becomes even more problematic. But where does that lead us? And here I'm going towards the end, Sarah, in respect of time. I started with the story of Lubanga. Lubanga fitting in the conflict in the Ituri. Lubanga being sentenced by the ICC. Lubanga being from the Hema community, being sentenced for crimes committed against basically Hema, which are minors enlisted in conflict. But Lubanga being this figure whose condemnation brings even an additional layer of conflict within the Hema community without even starting to talk about the Hema, Lendu, and others' relationships. I didn't dive into what the condemnation serves in terms of deterrence and the rehabilitation and so on, peacemaker and the rest. But what the Lubanga story tells us is how much the existing legal processes, structures, tend to only touch on the collective in a very performative way. It has been fashionable in ICC-related literature to talk about the collective dimension, collective reparation, building hospitals, building, reparative surgeries that they do, whether in northern Uganda or somewhere in the Democratic Republic of Congo. There are words that are in some cases only individualized, in others where they were both individualized and collectivized. Now, it sounds all interesting, but much of that really still misses the nuances about which collective are we talking about. So if the collective is about either serving the entire hospital, about the entire Hema community, if you will, or the Hema and the Lendu, it's very difficult to see how that connects to the additional layer of, for example, or responds to the additional layer of conflict created through prosecution within the Hema community, or how does that bring together the entire communities, or how that relates to the entire Congolese population, because Ituri is in the DRC. Now, I can go on, but and continue to not make sense, but probably I will try to not make sense by answering your questions. Thank you for your attention.
Oh, okay. You have one now. Okay. Oh, thank you so much, Felix. We have actually a very, very comfortable 20 minutes, I believe, for questions and comments. So who would like to go first?
Thank you so much, Felix, for this great, insightful presentation. And I just wanted to hear your thoughts on, well, if you could expand a bit on what you were talking there. I was thinking about, a sort of I don't even know how to say it, recollectivization that happens through the international criminal courts like the ICC, where, as you were saying, people are, or defendants are recast or repositioned, right? As well as what needs to be done in terms of justice. There's a recasting, so a certain reading of what collectivities are, and then an imposition almost of another vision of the collective as a means of doing justice. And I would like to hear your thoughts on that some more, please. Thank you.
Many of these conflict societies, of course, have their own dynamics, existing dynamics. So I guess always it's very important to pay attention to what is already there, what are the collective dynamics, and there are always most of the time, layers. So I talked about genealogy and stuff, but most of the time, if you are to look at different names, in many African societies, for example, you will belong to a clan, and then a clan belongs to, I very much resent the word tribe, but it's an ethnic community and so on. Even if some official documentation still use the word tribe, which I find quite a little bit something else. Now, there are certain given layers. One of my fascinating kind of study that I made in the legalistic sense was many probably who study minority rights have heard of the Andoroys case. The Andoroys are this Kenyan community which was removed from a land in the 80s owned by the Moi government and then sent back where else, and they went to the African Commission on Human and People's Rights claiming to return to that land, which is ancestral, there are spiritual values and all of the rest, which is part of the actually indigenous rights movement narratives. And they won the case before the African Commission on Human Rights. But what I found fascinating in that case was the articulation of the identity of the Andoroys. Kenya is one of those African countries which still have mapped ethnic communities. So they are still in official documents. So they say it's somewhere between 43 / something else, depending on the debates which are still going on in Kenya. And of course, on those official lists, the Andoroys were nowhere as a known ethnic community, let alone then call themselves an indigenous community. And if you look at in the literature, the Andoroys were not even at the second layer of being a sub-community of a community, because the Andoroys belong to what is known in that kind of listing, the Kalenjin. If you want cliche, the Kalenjin, most of them are some of the guys you see running in those marathons in the global north and winning. I'm here taking a very shortcut. Not all of them are, but quite a number of them tend to come from that community because of the area where they live and they train. So, but also it was the ethnicity of Moi. But they belong to the Kalenjin as a community, one of the mapped, and the Kalenjin community is mapped into the word I don't like, a number of tribes, and the Andoroys are not even there, but they are a subunit of one of the tribes, which is the Tugen, which was the ethnicity of Moi. So, looking at how they framed their identities in the 90s versus how they used to frame their identities in the 50s is quite important. So here, temporality matters, but also a renegotiation of identity based on certain given other processes and interests matters. But then, that is them defining their identities through other processes, of course, negotiating their identities within given environments. But when you go then to processes in which, of course, they have to encounter these court cases, yes, in other cases we have seen, in this Andoroys, of course, the way it's articulated there, for example, the African Commission said, yes, these Andoroys are an indigenous group, which is a very problematic category in Kenya, for example, as it is in Rwanda, as it is in quite a number of other African countries. So that is in another area other than international criminal law. But it speaks to your question about how identities are framed or reframed or carried in international criminal processes. So yes, we have seen literature, if you look at the literature at the ICC, they quite a few kind of analysis or a few kind of rulings when they are recounting the background and so on, they tend to fix quite a very essentialized kind of image of given identities. The complexities about, again, in time and space tend to be quite removed. And of course, these narratives tend to be quite very much used in supporting certain given claims or counterclaims. And in that sense, then, these institutions, to my mind, subject to studies that will be conducted of some of you, may influence in one way or another the ways people feel about themselves, the way they define themselves, both as individuals, but also importantly as collectives. And I mean, the value judgment is then something I would leave to anyone And the philosophical judgment probably is something I will hear from Siba and Kamari somewhere tomorrow.
Thank you very much for your presentation. It really, for me, got me thinking about that, should I call it the radical idea of, putting communities in the dock to, hold them accountable, because I could just imagine how the Ituru, that's the other community.
Ituri is the area, Lendu is the other community which was on the opposing end of the conflict with Lubanga and others.
Yeah, because I imagine that for them, they see an endorsement of the actions of Lubanga by the certain people, at least in Lubanga's community. And so what do we make of that? And how, when we also place this beside the dictates of the African Charter on Human and People's Rights that recognizes peoples, it really just gives us that room to see the gap that the international criminal justice system is unable to fill for African system of being or of making meanings. And as you were speaking, I could remember that I think in both Morambi and at least in two places, we heard people talk about how bodies were found in groups. And so, even within the discourse on who are victims, we congregate in groups. We know ourselves by groups, and we're not individual at all in nature. And so we've got this international criminal justice system that individualizes us to the extent that it almost becomes, useless for us, and does not even tackle the very root of what brings about these conflicts in the first place. And so, yeah, I really do appreciate your presentation, and it gives me further things to think about as I go on in this project of placing the community on the dock, and what we do to communities that endorse these behaviors or these actions that eventually leads to loss of lives.
I'm still kind of developing certain given thoughts on the way forward. And I didn't want to go back to, let's say, part of, for example, things that Phil presented about the necessity of Gacaca, for example, for the Rwandan society, and in that very specific, limited kind of realm, without thinking about the whatever applicability or inspiration that you may draw from other contexts. But at least Rwanda tried something different, unpopular, super criticized in many ways, but it pushed forward what he thought was right for them at a given time, and tried to as they tried to renegotiate life together after a very destructive conflict. Now, the way I see this issue of also individuation of criminal responsibility is how these whole structures that tend to individuate responsibility can impact quite many other alternative ways, and I think a few others said that including Phil as well, when people are trying to think creatively about solutions to after mass atrocities and violence. One example in the region, for example, is in the DRC. There have been for many years, since the end of 2000s, and there have been the debates about establishing some kind of ICTR DRC version. And they are very heated debates. And how much can you achieve for that country which has had many decades of destructive conflict? I mean, what my debate around individuation versus collective and which balance to strike brings in this debate is how much that type of system serves which victims. that's really what I'm debating as I go forward, thinking about these issues. A simple example that we tend to get is you take some top leader, a former minister in a given kind of place, conflict place. You put the person to trial, the big fish theory of international criminal justice. And you feel like you have somehow established responsibility for that particular person, in that particular context. There is certainly given a story that you tell indeed, and it matters. But I think many have written on what it means for the individual victim in some remote village somewhere. Who knows who was holding the stick that caused the harm? If the stick also can be a machete in that case. At least many victims I have spoken to in my research, some don't even know who that top guy is. So couldn't care less who that top guy is, despite not they are fed. What they want to see is that neighbor held responsible for what he or she did. And how that plays out then in the processes that we know. So my predictive sense is that if you are to establish that kind of international tribunal for Congo, you would do, ICTR did 100. If it's more ambitious, learning from in terms of efficiency, it will do a maximum 200. What is 200 prosecution in the realm of things in the kind of Congo situation? But most importantly, Congo has something close to 300 ethnicities. Who you pick matters. So are you going to pick 300 people from 300 ethnicity and say justice is done? Or are you going to pick from one because of some objective stuff which tends to be the reasoning behind this institution and not caring much about the collective, despite some performative balancing? So how you answer those questions, to me, also addresses or does not address both the individual level and collective level of both perpetration, but also victimhood. And most importantly, think in these terms. When we are talking about victimhood, sometimes you are going not only beyond what many scholars would call objective reality of victimhood, this happened, but also subjective perceptions of victimhood, which is part of the literature I previously shared.
Thank you, Felix, for that. I think it was perfect for the theme for today, as well as some of the critical issues that we need to continue to think about. And I wanted to, what I liked about the discussion is the ability to allow us to critique the individual liberal subject in many ways. And I really loved you heard me in the side as you read the names, as you recalled the names of your family. And I, very proudly listened, and the rhythmic way that you called on them as you introduced yourself to us halfway through your talk. And as you did that, I also, on one hand, was quite happy and proud of that ability to assert that lineage as a way to talk about the problem of individualization. And on the other hand, there was a sense of sadness that I can't do that I don't have that narrative. So that's aside, and we can talk about that question and how those of us on the other side of the Atlantic, in terms of the violence of what happened to the collectivity, the kind of violence of that exists. But it's not only our violence, where our names then and the forms of individualization that produced us on the plantation was a form of violence, but there's a form of violence in the African context in which the very categories aren't categories that are useful either, which is precisely what you've said, and we're dealing with the afterlife of that violence today. But that said, really what I wanted to do was connect it to other cosmological orders that are linked to the bones and collectivities that live on through the bones and beyond. So you helped us to think about collectivities in terms of the complexities that you described, but what about the life of the spirit? What about the burial of those bones? What about these other spaces? Because one of the challenges that we have is the way that Christianity has prescribed particular ways of thinking about life and death. And other religious forms have allowed us to think about life and death in ways. But the cosmological orders in which spirits live, and they live in those sites, and they continue to interact with people as they see them, through bones, through remains, through the sites and spaces and memories. Is there a way that you might extend your argument beyond the kind of recitation of ancestral lineage that makes you human and that makes you part of a collectivity to these other spaces that might be about the spirit and the bones, and some things that might make us more uncomfortable as we think about collectivities? Because I don't think international law has done that well, but there are many scholars of religion and other domains that with law try to tie that in, and I wonder how you think about that and whether that's a useful way to think about it.
That was recounted to me, and a number of others, including participating in this course, was apparently there was this person, and people from the West Africa, you will bear with me and correct me. So apparently there was this Tuareg at the African Commission on Human and People's Rights who came and sat and started, let's say, had to give testimony, but then before starting, he sat and performed his ritual, religious, spiritual ritual. And in the process, of course, the time allocated ended when the ritual was ending, and the person was thanked and had to go back home, take the flight back, before even speaking to the issue. That realm is important, and I haven't developed my thought on that, so confession maybe is needed here. But that being said, I like very much the writings of, for example, Ramamani, when she thinks in terms of what she calls integral justice. I edited one of the books where she talks about the notion in the field of transitional justice. Precisely, she thinks in terms of the necessity of connecting not only, let's say, these ideas narrow ideas we have of justice in terms of, let's say, criminal accountability, possibly reparation, and rehabilitation and so on, but also connecting that with the socioeconomic, with the developmental, and most importantly, also with the spiritual being, and all of those that make the person one and human. So she made the argument already from I think, a publication in 2008. I see the necessity of that. But again, part of not essentializing both the individual and the collective, and that's what I have been doing in at least underlining the complexities. So when I'm talking about collective, in many slides probably you saw me putting collectives with S at the end in brackets. It's because there are many layers of collective, and I understand that a person is complex and is part of one or multiple collectives, and the way you negotiate your way out of different collectives matters. And so there is not one given way of putting something on that. I also relate to the work on this, and I was saying that to one of my personalized discussion, the work of Amartya Sen on that, in his book on Identity and Violence, The Illusion of Destiny. I wish I had that on a slide, but I have somewhere on my computer. I drew one very important quote of his when he's presenting him as a subject of multiple identities that he does negotiate in time and space. As a Sanskrit, a philosopher, a feminist, of Hindu kind of descent, but who is secular, and all of that as something that defines him in everyday life, negotiating his place in the universe. So, yes, that is important. Yes, that is also negotiated and it has its place. But at the same time, the way we negotiate it today might not necessarily be the way we will negotiate it tomorrow. Definitely, I guess the prominent example I would say, I know very much that what we saw in Morambi yesterday is not what we used to do pre-genocide in terms of, let's say, laying the bodies of the departed ones. But certain given decision makers in Rwanda, after very many kind of processes, internal debates and negotiations that probably are still continuing, found that in order to address certain given challenges, including certain issues of strong denialism about what happened here, that might be a trade-off to make in terms of bearing witness to whatever happened here. How we think about that might differ from person to person, but at the same time, might vary from today to yesterday. And I guess that would be my simple kind of reflection around that topic, just subject to further developing it.